One election, 5 defections, and 3 by-elections later, Prime Minister Mark Carney's Liberals have secured a majority government. Former NDP MPP Dolly Begum is the new Liberal MP for Scarborough Southwest. The seat was previously held by former Cabinet Minister Bill Blair. Danielle Martin is the new Liberal MP for University Rosedale, a seat vacated after former Cabinet Minister Chrystia Freeland resigned earlier this year. And Tatiana Auguste makes 3. She holds on to her seat in Terrebonne after a closely fought contest with the Bloc Québécois candidate. Prime Minister Carney offered a glimpse today into what this majority could change for his government moving forward.
Showboating. We're going to have less of that. We're going to have more substance. I think all parliamentarians, in the end, will appreciate that, even if it's a change for some of them. We're building big, we're moving fast, and we're just getting started.
Okay, it's time for the Power Panel to talk about all of the events of the last 24 hours. So Prita Vetti was an advisor to former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Lisa Raitt is a former Conservative Cabinet Minister. Emily Nicolas is a columnist for Le Devoir, and Jordan Likeness is here with me in the studio. She is a former NDP strategist. Jordan, you've got home court advantage, so let's start with you. I mean, what do you make of the results last night and what the Prime Minister is suggesting it will allow him to do now that they have the majority?
Well, now the hard part begins. Because now that the government has secured a majority, there can be no more excuses for delays. It's time for the Prime Minister to be delivering on the mandate that he was given and quite clearly given in these by-elections. And so I think that it's interesting because over the last year, of course, we've seen very little legislation passed by the House. However, it hasn't necessarily been that the opposition parties have been extremely obstructionist. In fact, for the most part, folks have really been seeking to avoid an election. Particularly the Conservatives have gone out of their way to avoid an election, given their numbers. And so really, the holdup now can be squarely put on the government if there's delays in implementing their agenda. So I think that it's a win for sure. These by-elections give him the numerical majority that he needs to get those things done. Of course, also the floor crossers, which bring challenges as well as the majority numbers. But now the expectations are much higher, and he continues to drive them higher. I think that was a really interesting tone to his press conference today. Rather than tempering expectations, yet again, they're sending them higher and higher in terms of the speed at which they're going to move on these things. So we'll see. Yeah, I mean, Supriya, legitimately it is the floor crossings that delivered the majority. The by-elections were holds, right? Important to do. And Terrebonne, I don't know if technically is a hold because of the Supreme Court, but you know what I mean, right? It's really the floor crossings that gave them the numbers. So, the obstacles are gone with majority. The excuses also gone. What do you expect to see then from Prime Minister Carney and his team?
Look, I think I agree with a lot of what Jordan had to say. I think the only sort of counter or rebuttal that I think the Prime Minister and the government would throw back is they welcome it. They welcome the sort of challenge, and they've been sort of, champing at the bit for the last while to sort of get things done. And I would expect, some legislation to move forward. But to Jordan's point, she's right. I don't think this has been a super necessarily obstructionist parliament. I think what's interesting about this is that with respect to some of where I would have expected criticism that the Conservatives would raise, particularly around some of the digital policy initiatives that this government has put forward, like initially in Bill C2, now in Bill C22, for example, issues that should traditionally sort of rile up Conservatives in Bill C22's case, like effectively breaking encryption. You've seen very muted reaction from the Conservatives on this. And so it's interesting, at least from an outsider's perspective, to look at those dynamics, because the other thing I would say is that what I think this sort of really highlights, particularly when you do have a bunch of Conservatives that are somehow trying to, downplay this win or this majority as somehow being illegitimate or less than, it kind of just makes the Conservatives look like the bigger losers than they are right now, because in addition to like getting smoked by the Liberals, in these by-elections and having their vote share collapse across the board, kind of just looked like sore losers. And so I think it allows the Liberals to sort of continually sort of paint the Conservatives that way without themselves having to do it, because they're doing it for themselves, the Conservatives.
Lisa, what are your thoughts on what we saw last night and what we heard from the Prime Minister today?
Sure, a couple of things. I think that the Conservatives have no choice but to paint it in the way that they're painting it, in terms of the Prime Minister and his cabinet seeking out people to cross over to the government benches. Because if things don't work out in the beginning, or at the end, rather, you may be able to trace it all back to a narrative of the Prime Minister trying to gather up all kinds of power, and et cetera, et cetera. So you do need to start from somewhere. And I think this is what they're probably thinking about in terms of their narrative. I agree with what Jordan said at the very beginning, which is the hard part begins now, but from a different perspective. That 174 is great to have vis-a-vis the Parliament, but now you have, I would say, a very different caucus in front of you. And the opposition isn't necessarily the opposition across the aisle. It's the opposition within your own party that you really have to spend a fair amount of time balancing and smoothing. And I know that the Prime Minister and his cabinet want to drive forward and they want to tackle big issues, and I fully understand it. But man, you got to manage up, but you got to manage down as well. So
Right.
when you have your caucus with you, really important to make sure you maintain.
But Lisa, just a follow up on that, as someone who's been in a caucus, been in a governing caucus. He is the life raft for these Liberals, if you look at where they were 15 months ago, right? Like, do you really think that the people who were kind of saved by the Carney ascendancy and people recruited and wooed are going to become a problem for him very quickly, given the success of the past year?
No, I agree, Dave. I mean, that's a really good point. But I would say that there is going to be some extremely difficult topics and issues coming up for this government as they move forward vis-a-vis the United States. There's some stuff in there on digital that they're going to have to eat themselves
Right.
whole on, I think, quite frankly. Environment stuff, where it's going to land on carbon and oil pipelines. There's not a lot of radical agreement, I would say, within that caucus, and you never know what's going to happen. It's going to be tough. But my warning to the government is just don't assume you're going to have everybody singing from the same song sheet. You got some real big feelings in there.
Yeah, I gotcha. The disagreement over the consequences of choosing, as opposed to I want something for me and my rival
Right.
type thing. Yeah, I gotcha. Emily, your thoughts on it? We got Eric Grandy standing by to help us with some of the math, because that's not my strong point. Your thoughts on what we saw with the +3? I can do that kind of math, and what the Prime Minister is promising today.
Well, I'm really looking forward to see what's going to be different now that there is a majority. We haven't had a majority government basically since 2019, and the last time we had a minority government switch to a majority government was during the Harper years, and we really felt the change of tone back then. And so there's been a lot of questions in terms of how much, Mark Carney has been very much veering to the right when it comes to the Liberal Party that Justin Trudeau used to steer. And there's questions in terms of, his own decision making and his own ideas, as well as the part of it that was strategic to kind of eat away, both at the Conservative caucus, but also at the Conservative voting base. And quieting down, for example, what was happening in Alberta. But now that you have a majority government, usually this is when you show your true color without compromise. And so this is when we're going to be able to see who Mark Carney actually is long term, and how much of the veering to the right is fully him, and how much of it was we're going to overplay it for the first year as a way to eat at the Conservatives. And I agree with what was just said, that there's going to be a position from within, but it's not necessarily about making a ruckus. I think it's the same ways in which perhaps the right wing of the Liberal Party have been steering Mark Carney to the right. At some point, there is also people, for example, within Quebec, who used to be Bloc voters, used to be NDP voters, who want different things, who don't want pipelines. At some point, they are also really strong of the Liberal base coalition that is now built. And although they're really high in the polls, that doesn't mean that this vote also can be taken for granted. And so it's going to be an equilibrium game in terms of trying to push the button buttons and see who has what game of influence from within, while you can expect a diplomatic front where people will not try to rock the boat publicly. It doesn't mean that there's not real rivalry or positions or ideological debates from within.
No, a caucus with Marilyn Gladue and Stephen Guilbeault in it has got a range of perspectives.
Well,
I think that is safe to say. All right, look, we're going to bring in Eric Grenier because Conservatives across all three by-elections seemed to stay home last night, with the Conservative votes dropping dramatically in each of the three ridings. In the Toronto area riding of Scarborough Southwest, you can see the blue line drop from 31% of the vote to just 18%, with Liberals gaining their strongest lead in 25 years, the best result in a quarter century. Similar outcome in nearby University Rosedale, where the Conservative vote share dropped from 23.5% vote share to just 12.4%. But the most staggering results, it came from the Quebec riding of Terrebonne, where Conservatives dropped from 18.2% last April to just 3.3% of the vote this year. For more on what this all means for the future of the Conservative Party, I'm joined now by Eric Grenier from the writ.ca. So Eric, quite the change when you consider Toronto St. Paul, and these sorts of things. But, today in a press conference, Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet said his party lost last night because of the NDP and the Conservative vote collapse, even though the party performed better than last year. Just have a listen to this.
But I don't dispute the result. I just say that we did very well while everybody else crashed. We lost because even if we had a lot more votes in terms of percentage than last year, the Conservative crashed to 3.5%, and the NDP crashed to half of 1%, and almost all those votes went to the Liberals because of the situation in the world.
All right, so Eric, do you agree with that assessment from the Bloc leader?
Well, partially. I mean, it is true that the vote was polarized between the two parties, and over 95% of the vote went to either the Liberals or the Bloc, which is just an incredible kind of thing to see in a riding where, as that graphic showed before, the Conservatives had 18%. So, yes, certainly there was a lot of the Conservative and what was left of the NDP vote that likely went to the Liberals. But, the by-elections aren't just about who goes out to vote and who stays home. I know it seems that way because turnout is lower, but you do have people that are switching parties. And I do think that in this case, we certainly had a lot of Conservative voters who went to the Bloc as well, because we saw that the Bloc had lost a lot of support to the Conservatives in the last election. So I do think in Terrebonne, we did see that voters that were primarily with the Conservatives, some of them, yes, might have stayed home, but I think a lot of them, the Federalist side might have gone over to the Liberals, the more Sovereignist side might have gone over to the Bloc. And you got to have a little bit of sympathy for Yves-François Blanchet. When you have 47% of the vote in a riding like this, you usually win it. But the fact that it polarized and his party was on the wrong side of that polarization also says something that the Bloc has to think about too.
Yeah, they got squeezed yet again in a riding that has been theirs for a decade. But look, these are not Conservative ridings, but when you look at the decrease in the Conservative votes overall, they are the official opposition. Pierre Poilievre talks about the 8.3 million people who voted for him last year. They have more money than any other party, and these were double-digit drops in all the seats. What should we take away from that?
Yeah, that was actually probably the biggest surprise. Terrebonne was close. Yeah, everyone thought it was going to be close. The Liberals were going to walk in the two Toronto ridings. No big surprise there. But for the Conservatives to drop to 3% in Terrebonne, which is, as far as I can tell, the worst result the party's ever had in the history of the riding, that part of Quebec, to have some of the worst results they've ever had in the two Toronto ridings, to drop double digits, as you've said. Conservatives have been performing very well in by-elections over the last decade. You have to go back to the Stephen Harper years to find, and I should say the end of the Stephen Harper years, to find these kinds of drops in by-elections. That is not something that you would expect when the party is still supposed to be competitive. And it does suggest that the polls that have been putting the Conservatives quite a bit lower than where they were in the last election might be onto something. Yes, a lot of Conservative voters were probably pretty depressed and didn't bother to go out to vote, especially since none of these ridings the Conservatives were in contention in. But in other ridings across the country over the Justin Trudeau years, when he was very unpopular, Conservatives went out to go vote, even if it wasn't Conservative riding. So I do think there is a big issue for the Conservatives here. They should be doing a lot better than this if they are still in the high 30s, nearing 40%. as Pierre Poilievre would still like to suggest when he talks about how many votes he got in the last election.
Right, and well, I mean, elections are an etch-a-sketch, right? You shake it up and it's a blank screen when you start over, and the polling would suggest it's dropped since then. So we've had 5-4 crossers, 4 of them from the Conservatives. Now we've got a Liberal majority government. So where does this leave, do you think, Pierre Poilievre's political future? Because the argument has been this gives him time, he can reset, he can recalibrate. I don't know. How do you see it?
It does give him time to try to close that gap with Mark Carney, but it also gives time for everybody to get fed up with him in the Conservative ranks. So it can go both ways. If we see in another 2 years the Conservatives are still polling somewhere in 30 to 35% in most polls, a lot of Conservatives might ask themselves, well, Aaron O'Toole got that and Andrew Scheer got that, and that wasn't good enough. So why are we still thinking that Pierre Poilievre is better than a generic Conservative? I think that he really needs to show some growth over the next few years, because it's just been a bit of a drumbeat of bad news for him with the floor crossers. The polling has been getting worse for the party. You can't still be 10, 15 points behind and hope to hold on to your leadership after you've lost an election. Now, will the Liberals hold at 45 plus for, indefinitely? Almost certainly not. But there's no, just as there's no guarantee that the Conservative numbers will go up, there's no guarantee that the Liberal numbers will go down.
No, that is absolutely true. Eric, always appreciate it, man. That's Eric Grenier from therit.ca. Okay, so that's what the voters decided last night. And when asked about Pierre Poilievre's leadership in the face of a new Liberal majority, several members of the Conservative caucus today say they are standing fully behind him.
I'm 100% supportive of Pierre. Mr. Poilievre is doing an excellent job, and I support his leadership.
Pierre has done well in leadership review. We have some members who have left. They've given up, frankly. I will bet you not one of them runs again in the next campaign. They're out of gas, and they've given up, unfortunately. The rest of us are going to soldier on and win the next election.
The message that we got from Canadians came loud and clear last year with the vote share that we received with 140 members in our caucus who continue to support and believe in Pierre Poilievre's leadership, and we're going to keep working hard for Canadians because that's what we promised.
Okay, let's bring back the power panel. So Priya Vetti, Lisa Ray, Jordan Leiknitz, and Emily Nicola. Lisa, what are your thoughts on that? What we've heard from what the numbers tell us, what Grenier's analysis was, and what the Conservatives are saying publicly, and I don't know, maybe privately.
Got to wonder whether or not there is any kind of strategic voting happening in Terrebonne. I know that there is some, gossip about it on social media that if you're not going to vote, instead of voting for Conservative, vote for the Bloc in this case. I don't know if that's the case. Certainly, we're never going to know. But I would say this, look, if I were sitting in the same situation in a caucus, I think the one question that I'd be asking myself and I'd be talking to my colleagues about and leveling with them is, like, let's be truthful and honest with one another. Do you truly believe that Pierre Poilievre can lead us to win in the next election? You just saw 3 members who said, yeah, we believe that. We think that he can lead us to win in the next election. Because it's not about how well you govern right now. It's not about how great you are in the House of Commons as a leader of the opposition. You got to be able to win. And that's what this all comes down to. And I think Conservatives across the country are going to be asking them that question to themselves right at the moment. And it is the right question to ask. And don't be surprised if the Conservatives come back and say, yeah, we think this is the guy who's going to win.
Emily, how do you see it? Because this was the 4th election defeat in a row, and now it's a majority, which means Mark Carney can stay there until October 15th of 2029. They say it gives them time. That's a lot of time to continue to sit in the opposition benches.
For sure. And with the 3 by-election that we just saw this weekend, it's also ridings that are based in Ontario and Quebec. And so it's also, I think, an indication of the growth ability of the Conservative Party under Pierre Poilievre. And that's always been the issue with him, is that he is well liked with the people that like him, but the people that dislike him really dislike him, and they do tend to live in the 2 most populated and riding rich provinces in the country. And so it's been a real problem for Pierre Poilievre, and I don't know that there is, even if you look at the national numbers and how high he polls there, if all of those are concentrated in the same very safe conservative riding, it doesn't necessarily show on the map in terms of election results. It doesn't necessarily mean a path to victory if you win all of the vote in Alberta, Saskatchewan, essentially. And it's a leadership style that has got him stuck in some region of the country and really made him super polarizing in other parts of the country. And I think with every time the war gets worse, every time the situation with Donald Trump gets worse, it makes people even more unlikely to approach a leadership style that is rooted sometimes in populism and in style, and see it as something that Canada needs at this point. And so at the end of the day, it's about the geopolitics and making Pierre Poilievre really hard to have, for him to have actually room for growth given the current context that Canada's in.
Okay, Jordan, I want to get you in here, but before we do, I just want to play the clip. A clip. Mark Carney was asked about this today, and it's from an interview Pierre Poilievre did with the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, where Pierre Poilievre he raised some questions about the Prime Minister's skill and education in economics. Just have a listen to this.
There's one thing that's worse than being uneducated, and it's being badly educated. And Mr. Carney is very badly educated on economics. It's hard to understand how a guy who claims to be so smart can be so wrong for so long.
So Jordan, I mean, we've seen attempts to change things. Is that the sort of thing that turns it around if you're the Conservatives in a moment like this?
Like that kind of behavior? Definitely no. Yeah, I think exactly what we're seeing there. This is some of the worst impulses of Pierre Poilievre as a leader. And I think that the problem is it's very personal to him. It's his negatives that are dragging his party down. It's his personal unfavorability that's a problem. And we've seen over the last couple of months an attempt on the part of Mr. Poilievre to change his approach, to go to the US, to engage in more mainstream media interviews, to moderate his message somewhat. And it's not helping. It doesn't seem to be turning his numbers around. And it seems we see some evidence with examples like this, that when he feels under pressure, as his MPs have continued to cross the floor, that he reverts to what is comfortable for him, which is a persona that is very negative. And so I think the challenge for the Conservatives is that the time that they have been given with this majority government is maybe more a curse than a blessing, because it can give the members of that caucus time to look around the table and say, we have enough time before the next election to replace him as leader.
Supriya, what are your thoughts on where things stand with this?
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with a lot of that. I also think that having somebody like Pierre Poilievre criticize the Prime Minister's economic credentials is sort of like me questioning the basketball credentials of Michael Jordan. It's like, what are you even talking about right now? To a regular person, you just, again, like with the point I was making earlier, you just sort of look like a sore loser. And in addition to the question that Lisa, rightfully pointed out, that Conservatives have to be asking themselves, can we actually win with this guy? The other thing is, like, is there any real introspection as to why Canadians are currently kind of leaving them en masse right now? And I think for everyone that isn't currently in that, Conservative bubble right now, it's really clear to the rest of us why Canadians much prefer the leadership of the Prime Minister and his government. And it's because they're able to paint a vision for the country that gives Canadians some level of, reassurance or confidence amidst all this turmoil and uncertainty that is happening both geopolitically as well as economically.
Right. So, Lisa, what are your thoughts? I mean, does that kind of an attack, does that work? Does that work with voters? Does that land? I mean, because, look, Mark Carney has a PhD from Oxford in economics, and he's the only person ever to run like 2 G7 central banks, right? So he clearly knows something about economics. Is that the sort of tack that helps the Conservatives?
I think what Pierre was trying to explain was a concept wherein he believes that, yes, the Prime Minister has great economic education, but he's making bad economic choices. And I don't think he landed the analogy. I think that's just what it came down to. And it came off as the way everyone is perceiving it. But you got to be careful when you're saying those kinds of things, because there is one thing that Mr. Carney leads on, and that is the fact that he is a really smart guy. So anyone saying that he's not a smart guy or he's bad at something, it's not an easy nuance to land, and I don't think Pierre landed it here.
Okay, I want to pivot to one last thing, and this is the policy announcement from the government today, because they actually did some of that the day after securing the majority government. The Prime Minister, he announced new affordability measures for Canadians today. Have a listen.
We know that Canadians are feeling the pressures of everyday expenses right now. We know they need a boost today and a bridge to tomorrow. Canada's new government will temporarily suspend the federal fuel excise tax from next Monday until Labor Day.
Emily, when you cut a tax by 10%, or sorry, by 10 cents, even if it's temporary, it's pretty hard to raise it back up, isn't it? Do you think if conditions don't improve in the Middle East, there's going to be some pressure to keep this down? What do you make of this move and the situation it maybe creates?
It really reminds me of the situation the Liberals put themselves in when it was about AXA tax, the carbon tax. Instead of basically not bulging, you give essentially, you give in for an exception, and then the exception widens, and then you cannot backtrack, and you've just made you dig a hole for yourself. I think there's potential for that there. And you've already seen it in Pierre Poilievre's response, is that it's not good enough. You could do more, and you could do it for longer. And you should be also cutting that other tax and that other tax. And so I don't think that Pierre Poilievre is going to be like, yay, Mark Carney did that, so we're going to drop that bone and switch topic. And the prices are going to be remain higher than they used to be. And it's never going to be politically... people are never going to applaud you when you put the tax back on, and so it's going to be really, really hard for Mark Carney to trying to get himself out of that in the future. We'll see with Labor Day. Maybe, I don't know, his expectation is that people will be paying attention to something else, or that the geopolitical situation will have changed. But I don't think there is any day that the Canadians will be seeing a sharp 10-cent raise in gas prices and thank the Prime Minister for it.
Yeah, I mean, Jordan, this is what I wonder about, because I did interview the finance minister earlier on the show, and it's a time-limited cut driven by circumstance, right? And we don't know what the circumstances will be. So what kind of a position does this maybe put them in?
Well, it's tricky, right? Because I think that Canadians clearly need some help right now. The cost of living has just become such a burden for people, and the energy crisis stemming from the war in Iran has made everything so much worse. So I understand the impulse, and I think clearly this was chosen as well as their first announcement on their first day of majority government to send a signal that they are putting some emphasis on affordability issues, because they really haven't done that very much up until now. So that's all well and good, but they do have a problem in September. I find it unlikely that our global economic situation will be radically improved by then. Who knows what President Trump will be up to that will increase global instability and prices. So it could be tough to put it back. The other thing is, this is going to blow a hole in the federal budget. So how is this going to be paid for? There is, I think, also, of course, a role of profit here, where oil companies are doing very well with these increased prices, and the government could have the option to add on to this something like a windfall profits tax that could be a way to fund some of these taxes.
Yeah, I suspect, I remember every time oil went up back home in Newfoundland and Labrador, how much revenue just spiked because of royalties and corporate income tax. That should offset the cost of this, but who knows, right? Like, the deficit's still massive, right? So, Priya, this is the challenge, right? I mean, maybe it's political malpractice not to use the windfall you're going to get from oil and gas going up to offer some relief. You look at Ireland, the Taoiseach was supposed to be on the show yesterday, but they had to cancel the trade mission to Canada because of protests there over the cost of fuel. So it can become a contagion if you don't do something to deal with it. I think that's where they felt they were today.
Yeah, for sure. And like, there's no doubt that people are hurting right now, right? And Canadians could use all the sort of pocketbook relief they can get. And I would just say that I do believe Lisa suggested some version of this measure on the panel just last week. So I think to Jordan's point about this looking like you're extending an olive branch to the Conservative folks, it's likely that. And I think also the Conservatives tend to be on good footing when they can make the point that something doesn't go far enough in terms of an affordability measure, that they have a superior policy solution that could make for it even better for Canadians at the pump, let's say. But if they're just out there complaining that the Prime Minister is stealing, Poilievre's ideas, I think, again, to my earlier point, it just makes them look like a bunch of weak complainers for the most part. In addition to what Jordan said about, perhaps not using a windfall tax here, the other interesting thing to me is that a fair criticism of this approach of cutting fuel taxes is that it might be more prudent in the longer term to do things that are, making it easier to not to consume fuel, but to more things on the conservation side, right? Like a bunch of jurisdictions have encouraged folks to work from home, as an example, though I doubt the Conservatives would be the ones to really make that argument. I would be curious to see if you start to hear some of that more from, Avi Lewis and the NDP.
No, it's interesting, though. I think Pierre Poilievre has talked about flexibility in the workplace because, when he was an Ottawa MP, because he had a lot of civil servants in his riding. I don't know if that applies now that he's in Battle River Crowfoot. But Lisa, I don't know if they stole this idea from Pierre Poilievre. Maybe they stole it from you. But what do you make of this move with the excise cut and your ability to put it back in place, in a few months from now in September?
Yeah, look, I don't have a problem with them putting it back in place should the price go back down again, meaning the price of oil at the pump. I think they'll be okay doing that. They can say it's time limited. It makes a lot of sense. I'm curious about the timing of it all. And the read to me is the policy levers were always very clear as to what could be done. The question was, when did the Prime Minister pull the lever? He pulled it yesterday. My mind goes to the fact that something bad is coming in the economy, far worse than what we're dealing with right now. He's trying to get ahead of it. I think there's a foreshadow of exactly what this closing of the ports in Iran and the Strait of Hormuz is going to wreak havoc on the supply chain and on the price of everything. And it's going to pop up. So the Prime Minister's in a spot to say, look, I already did something. We got ahead of it. So for me, it's about the timing. But the policy fix was always really clear. That's the only way.
Do you think that's what it is? The failure of the talks in Pakistan and the escalation of things over there? Like it seems like that's okay, it's not going to be resolved. We've got to act.
I do. And I think Supriya or somebody put their finger on it already about what's happening in Ireland, or maybe you said it too, David. But look, all the signals coming from Europe right now is that they are bearing down for a heck of a hit on the economy and on the cost of things in the short term, like 6 to 8 weeks, if not sooner. And I think they're probably hearing that here in Canada and are trying to get ahead of some real pain coming. Yeah,
I mean, Emily, there's decent projections from the IMF today that, Canada is going to be second in the G7 in growth, about 1.5%, twice what Germany, twice what Japan, twice what some of the big economies are going to do. But that's all caveated, right? That if what Trump has done with Iran persists, we could be looking at global recession and everybody's growth gets dragged down. Now, oddly, high oil prices helps lift Canada's GDP, but it drives up cost, right? So not just on energy, but fertilizer and food, there is the real potential, Emily, for things to get pretty expensive over the next couple of months.
Yeah, my personal worry is the midterm election and how much of an emotional tantrum Donald Trump can throw by then. Is I think the biggest geopolitical threat on the map is trying to look good while you're having to face accountability from inside America. And so when that 6-month period, and we're in September, and with Labor Day, and Mark Carney has to look at what other policies he's either putting back up or not, we're going to be getting very close to that midterm election, and I don't know that there's going to be less geopolitical turmoil back then. Maybe we're going to remember the beginning of 2016 as the good old days, and so that's the way I would predict it now. But we'll see in the fall. But I really think that before, if we're not over that midterm bump, we need to brace ourselves for a lot of high volatility scenario.
Yeah, and Jordan, the focus is on the price at the pump, obviously. Oil and gas is what you talk about with the Middle East, but the fertilizer component food inflation,
Absolutely.
right? And if you are at the lower end of the economic scale, you
Or
spend...
even in the middle.
Right, but your money's on shelter, food, and energy. You're getting hammered well and above whatever the headline inflation is.
And already we've seen grocery prices over the last few years have gone up 30% in Canada. They're not going down anytime soon. So I think this is an issue that's going to be of growing relevance and urgency for Canadians. We're seeing really kind of horrific statistics about food bank use. And even the need to limit that kind of help because of food prices. So I think that the demands for the government to do something, whether it's government-run grocery stores or something else entirely, on food prices is going to continue to be there and going to continue to be very politically relevant.
So, Supriya, what kind of choices do you think the new majority government of Canada's new government, as they like to call themselves 10 years in, might have to face, if this persists? Because there are 1,011 days and 6 hours left in the Trump presidency, and it doesn't seem to be de-escalating at the pace that would make Canadians comfortable. So what do you think it could force this government into?
Yeah, I mean, look, that's a great question. And Emily kind of laid out her fears about midterms and what the president can do, thereafter in terms of any, forthcoming hissy fits or whatever. I mean, my worry is probably one step further because I worry about whether midterms are actually going to be fully free and fair and held properly, right? And I think that's a question. I mean, if you look at the White House gift shop, like they're selling Trump 2028 merch. Like what? Like it's possible if he's still, around and healthy enough that he could possibly try and extend his term. And for the folks that are right now being like, what? How is that even possible? Isn't it unconstitutional? I think if it goes up to the Supreme Court, again, on a balance of probabilities, it's not a slam dunk that they would suggest that is an abuse of his power and that it should be interpreted in a way that he didn't serve 2 consecutive terms, et cetera, et cetera. And so, look, in terms of what the government can do themselves, the prime minister has been saying this from the jump since he was elected, which is they're going to control what they can control. They obviously can't control the external exogenous factors, and what they can control. I don't know if from a federal government perspective, if a government-run grocery store would be the route that a Carney government would necessarily want to choose. But it's clear that if food prices are going to go the way a lot of folks, very smart folks, are predicting, and all of the signals are suggesting, then Canadians are going to need relief, beyond, I think that's what's just being currently discussed publicly by the Liberal government.
Okay, on that super optimistic note, we're going to say goodbye. I miss these conversations. Supriya, Lisa, Emily, and Jordan, it's good to see the four of you. Thanks so much for being here.